Hello there. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, a weekly program where we review the week's news with leading journalists from around the world. And this week we're joined by Karen DeYoung, associate editor and senior national security correspondent of the Washington Post. Karen, wonderful to have you back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Also joining us for the first time, Nirmal Ghosh, who is the U.S. bureau chief of the Straits Times. Nirmal, wonderful to have you.
Thank you for having me.
And Philip Stevens, who is the associate editor and chairman of the board chairman of the editorial board of the Financial Times. Philip, great to have you back. You're on mute, but it's good to have you.
Great to be back. I'm sorry.
It's much easier when we're off mute, but we'll get started. Let's start with one of the big stories, Karen. The Pentagon's announcement that we're going to remove 12,000 troops from Germany. This came after a couple of weeks ago when the first reports were out that was so upset with Germany to remove troops, and now we have a strategic rationale, or at least one is presented by the Pentagon. What was announced this week, and what is its implication?
Well, you're right. This was kind of the other shoe dropping from when the president very early this month said we're going to take. I think he said, I don't know how many thousands of troops he said out of Germany. The Pentagon announced this week that they were going to remove about a third of what are about 35,000 U.S. troops based in Germany, up to 12,000. Secretary Esper, the defense secretary, said that about 5,600 of these troops, mostly headquarters units, would be moved to Italy and to Belgium, and that the other 6,400 would be sent back to the United States. He described this as a result of a strategic review that the United States has been doing for the past year about the deployment of troops overseas all around the world, of which there are about 200,000. That this would make NATO better, it would make U.S. security better, and that it would increase security against the Russians by moving at least rotational troops to the Baltics, to more to Poland, troops that go in and out. Of course, the president immediately after this announcement said, yeah, we're moving them because we don't like Germany. And Germany is cheating us and they're not paying enough money. And he keeps confusing the amount of money that Germany and other NATO countries spend on their own defense with what they actually contribute to NATO. And basically said it's very simple, and I'll rethink the whole thing if Germany starts paying their bills. This is part of which the president in 2016 said he was going to significantly reduce the number of U.S. troops overseas. In fact, they have increased a little bit. And as the next election grows closer, I think the president's very eager to get troops home from somewhere so he can say that he fulfilled his 2016 campaign pledge. When the administration started, they first went after South Korea and said, we're going to pull troops out of there unless they pay us a lot more money. There was a negotiation that did increase it by a little bit, the South Korean payments, until last year. That agreement expired last year, and they've been negotiating, and the Americans have sort of been yelling at them ever since. They have not come to a new negotiation. They're supposed to negotiate with Japan. The current agreement with Japan has a deadline of next March. The president has tried to bring troops home from Afghanistan. He's been reminded by the Pentagon that we have this agreement with the Taliban that calls for a phased reduction of troops that's conditions-based, and the Taliban haven't met the conditions yet. He's tried to bring more troops home from Syria, where we actually only have fewer than 1,000. And so finally, he came around to Germany. Again, there's this dissonance between what the president says is the meaning of all this and the kind of strategic context that the Defense Department has tried to put it in. NATO's, in terms of the NATO leadership, Secretary General Stoltenberg has said, well, very interesting, we're all consulting on this. The Germans have said there was no consultation on this. You didn't tell us until we read about it in the newspaper. So, a lot of people think there are good reasons for moving around these troops, maybe not to the places where the Defense Department has said they want to move them. But I think at the same time, a lot of people think it's a political ploy and that it was handled in that way by the administration.
Nirmal, how does your region, where the American presence really has been stabilizing for so long, read this, not only this particular decision, but the whole idea that reductions in troops is something we ought to be thinking about. As Karen said, one of the rationales for bringing some of the troops home that Secretary Esper emphasized was greater flexibility. Presumably, it's easier from the United States to move to Asia than from Europe, and that may be one signal that they're being sent. Is that how it is interpreted, or is seen in a larger context that Karen has put it, that the United States is looking for ways to reduce its foreign presence?
I think it's somewhat paradoxical because the region is still trying to figure out exactly your question. There is a sense that the U.S. has become a somewhat unreliable partner. You cannot take the U.S. for granted anymore. And yet, at the same time, you do have with the US, there's been a lot of grudging appreciation for the fact that the US under President Donald Trump is actually standing up to China. And the region, of course, is Southeast Asia in particular is sort of, as we know, caught in the middle and does not want to be put in a position where it has to make a choice between the US and China. So they have to live with China on their doorstep and sometimes on the actual border. But the US has been a binding influence. The security presence has been a binding influence for so long that they are used to it. They do not want a disturbance to that status quo. Having said that, they, I think, welcomed the US's recent strong statement on the South China Sea in particular, which in fact actually didn't contain anything radically new. I mean, they said all this stuff in 2014. The State Department said this in 2014, rejected China's claims, 9-dash line, etc. However, this was, if you see it in the context of the overall pushback against China as a strategic competitor, it becomes more significant. And they also mentioned specifically, features like the second Thomas Shoal and Natuna, etc., which was somewhat new, you could say, and delimiting, setting out sort of lines, maybe not red lines, but lines to China's sort of claims. However, we still have to see what happens on the ground, or in this case, on the water, because a lot of these lines have already been crossed, right? I mean, China has been creating fait accompli in the South China Sea for a while now. So what are you going to do? Is the Philippines or some other country going to actually try and throw the Chinese out of a feature which is occupied? I mean, that seems to be a rather far-fetched proposition. If there is an incident, say with the Philippines, with the Philippine Naval Patrol or something, is an incident going to be considered sufficient enough to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty with the US? And the US has much more assets, as we know. They have 2 aircraft, recently at least, they had 2 aircraft carriers in the region, as opposed to just one, which is occasionally passing through. So this whole thing is being seen with some trepidation, and also with a sense that the risk in the next 3 to 4 months is quite grave, the risk factor, because of the domestic US situation, the political campaign, and the high sort of volume rhetoric on China, which has become front and center. China has become front and center because not only strategic competitor, but now the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is the next 3-4 months in particular are being seen with some trepidation in the region.
Philip, how is it seen in Europe? Is this seen as part of a strategic towards Asia competition with China, as Nirmal is wondering that is happening, or is this seen and a reduction in some ways of American participation and preoccupation with Europe, or is it seen in this more general way that the United States is retreating from the world and its troops are moving away? What's the reaction in London and in Europe more generally?
Well, I think it's certainly not seen as a sort of strategic or Pentagon-driven move. I mean, I think the view, certainly in London, is that the Pentagon was giving cover for a decision which was really the president's and the president's expression of anger rather than anything else. He's never made any secret of his dislike for Angela Merkel. He's beaten on the drum of Germany spending more of its GDP on defense consistently. And he's also been angered and said so by Germany's support for the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia. So this is seen as a sort of, a swipe back before the November election. I mean, German politicians were pointing out this week that if you're transferring troops to Italy and Belgium, both of those two countries spend a smaller share of their GDP on defense than does Germany. And actually, Germany's expenditure has been rising quite fast. I think the real concern, though, is not so much this move, but the signal that it sends to Russia. It's another signal to Vladimir Putin that NATO's resolve, as it were, is weak, because there is a question mark over how far President Trump will go to push back against President Putin. And there is a sort of fear as well that even if there is another president who took a different view, once you lose troops, it's harder to get them back. But it's not seen in military terms to make any particular sense, and very much seen as a personal decision by the president, sort of dressed up by the Pentagon to look rather better than it is.
Karen, on this Russia point, we also had this week had the president in an interview with Axios, where he was asked whether in his last phone conversation with Putin he had raised the issue of Russia apparently paying bounties to go after to the Taliban to go after American soldiers. That he said, no, I had other issues on the mind, and the only country, the only capital that seemed to have welcomed the move by the president on German troop withdrawals was Moscow, which said we'd always like less troops, and they said it quite openly. How do we read this when Pompeo yesterday on Capitol Hill said, no, we have the strongest anti-Russia policy of any administration ever? How should we really think about this?
Well, I think you've had throughout the Trump administration this dichotomy between tough actions, a lot of sanctions, throwing out diplomats, really participating in NATO insofar as NATO's tried to move more forces and reposition more equipment closer to Russia's borders, take in more members that Russia considers within its sphere of influence, continue to complain about Ukraine, send lethal weaponry to Ukraine. So that's on one side. On the other side, you have President Trump, who has consistently, really since long before he was president, reached out to President Putin, described him as a strong leader, and has publicly said, both standing at Putin's side and not standing at Putin's side, that the whole Russia interference in the 2016 election was a hoax. So you have those two things. The question is, what does that mean in terms of U.S., what is the actual U.S. policy, and what does Putin take away from it? I think in terms of U.S. policy, you see a lot of tactical moves, but you don't really see a strategy. You don't see an attempt to use diplomacy with Russia, to figure out what it is we want from Russia and what's the best way to get it, what Russia wants, and what are we willing to give them in order to get something that we want. So whenever there's an attempt to come up with some kind of strategy, to the extent there has been, the president sort of says, "Oh, never mind. We don't need to deal with this because President Putin is a great leader and he's my friend and I can talk to him." But then he doesn't talk to him about these things. Some would argue that a conversation between the two leaders, particularly over this issue of reports of Russian intelligence paying bounties to the Taliban to kill American soldiers, you're not really ready for the president to bring that up with President Putin. There's been no spade work for it. There's been no, as far as we can tell, conversations at lower levels. There's been no, again, attempt to put it into a strategy because there isn't a strategy. So I think that this plays into U.S. politics. Once again, I'm not sure it plays very much into U.S. Russia relations, which are kind of everywhere and nowhere at the moment. And also, Congress kind of has its own policy on Russia. And you look at many of the things that the tough things the administration says that it's done vis-a-vis Russia, and many of them have been pushed by Congress, which has jumped into this void, this kind of lack of a strategy, and kind of made their own strategy, mostly revolving around sanctions against Russia.
Nirmal, if there isn't a clear strategy towards Russia, and I think that's Karen is right on that issue, and there's a confusion. There's now an attempt to have a strategy vis-a-vis China. The South China Sea that you just mentioned, in terms of the aircraft carriers, the declaration on the illegality of Chinese claims, et cetera, seems to be part of that. What's the region's view of what the strategy is, or if there is a strategy? How does the folks in Southeast Asia look at that?
I think what Karen said earlier is very pertinent. It's more tactical than strategic. I mean, you can see elements of a strategy with China because you have this full court offensive from the US government against China, academics, investment, telecoms, the whole thing. However, it's similar in East Asia and Southeast Asia. I mean, this argument with South Korea over the cost of keeping troops there. All these do not sort of bode very well. I mean, in some cases, you could argue that this has forced countries to take on more of burden sharing. I mean, for example, Japan has hiked its defense budget. So it is possible you could sort of make an argument that this is a good thing, that the countries over there are becoming more mindful of the fact that the US is erratic, at least under this administration. Mind you, the past administration was seen as wishy-washy in terms of the South China Sea. The pivot to Asia was sort of half-baked. So nothing really much happened. It was all nice. But that diplomacy of those days has been replaced by this sort of tactical approach. And the problem is that there are so many frictions in Asia right now. I mean, look what happened with China and India. And I know that the US and would like to see the Quad, I think, which is Australia, those four countries, would like to see sort of congeal into something more real and into some sort of force. But India is reluctant. India likes to preserve its strategic autonomy. It's buying weapons from Europe. It's buying stuff from Israel. It's buying from Russia and so forth. So it prefers to maintain a strategic autonomy. So and then you have again, going back to the tensions within Asia, you have South Korea and Japan, like who knew that, issues would come up again earlier this year. So you have all these underlying tensions, which could very well surface in the absence of the sort of binding agent which the US provides. And again, the US has seen President Trump has not shown up at some of the meetings. All these things send signals, whether they're important or not in President Trump's eyes is irrelevant to Asia. I mean, they like to see evidence, symbolism. They want to see US leaders turning up at ASEAN meetings and so forth. So there is a uncertainty and some apprehension that the US will send mixed signals, beefing up on the one hand, saying it might put missiles in Asia, for example, which also came up this year. And on the other hand, not showing up at meetings. So there's a little bit of dissonance over there, which I think is, mirrors the situation if you look at it from Europe's point of view. So pretty much the same situation there.
Philip, you had a column today in the paper, in your paper, the Financial Times, arguing that there is a coherent strategy, it's just the wrong one when it comes to China.
Well, I think there are two. Well, there's one strategy, which is the one set out by Secretary of State Pompeo, I think, at the Nixon Library in a big speech last week, which is a speech that's greatly unnerved European allies because it casts the contest of confrontation with China as comparable to the Cold War with the Soviet Union. It says that China's ambitions are not simply to push out in its own neighborhoods, but to sort of to impose Chinese communism on the rest of the world, just as the Soviet Union wanted to do during the Cold War. And it basically writes off the 50 or 49 years of opening to China, which started with President Nixon in 1971. So there's that part. But then, and that's all about, and that's sort of dressed up, if you like, in the language of freedom and democracy. That's caused a lot of alarm in Europe because European governments, by and large, although they're moving to look, we have to be tougher with China, they also almost invariably take the view that you actually have to find a way of dealing and engaging with China as well as drawing your own lines. But then there's, again, the president's view, and he doesn't seem to care much about democracy or freedom or in the relationship with China. Indeed, in John Bolton's book recently, it was said that Trump, in talks with Xi Jinping, had said, you're clamping down on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. Go ahead, I'd do the same. So again, you have this disjunction between the policy of, quote, the administration and the policy of the president, which is pro-strongman. I mean, the president has made it clear with Putin, with Xi Jinping, with Erdogan, with Kim in North Korea, that he actually quite likes these guys who aren't Democrats. So Europe now is really, I think, quite worried that we may be heading into a confrontation with China, which doesn't have the containment of the Soviet Union was something that came about first with Kennan and then the Truman Doctrine and then beyond. But it involved a lot of careful thought and careful work between the allies and agreement between the allies. It was a Western project. The United States doesn't seem to be suggesting there should be a Western project or a democratic project to deal with China. Seems to be saying, this is what we intend to do, and all you guys, you Europeans and you Asians, you better sign up to it.
So, Karen,
just to say, I think Philip's right, but I think also that you look back to U.S.-Soviet relations, excuse me, and you see that even in the worst times, there was a dialogue going on. There was a level of diplomacy that kind of kept things from getting out of hand in most cases. You don't see that now with either Russia or China. You see, again, a lot of tactical moves. The administration obviously wants to continue at some level a trade relationship with China because it, as Europe needs it, it wants to change the rules, fine, but it's not really engaging in the kind of diplomacy that would be necessary to change the rules. Now, it's not clear that China is interested in that either at this point. But I think that in terms of having the Western project that Philip spoke about, the EU reached out several weeks ago and said, look, can we and the United States just sit down and come up with a diplomatic, strategic project on China? Can we work together? The United States, Pompeo has now said, yep, we're going to do that. We've told them, yep, we're going to all sit down together. We're going to have a commission, but nothing really has happened out of that so far. And I think the administration is kind of running out of time to do something like that. So we'll just have to wait and see if they're serious about actually having some kind of joint position, or at least even talking about a joint position vis-a-vis China.
Well, challenges just has been over the past few weeks and just overnight again is the issue of Hong Kong, where clearly there was a U.S., European, East Asian, Southeast Asian view that the one country, two systems and not independent, a freer Hong Kong was in everybody's interest. And we've seen that being cracked down over the past few months, including yesterday with arrests and the disqualification of candidates, and now overnight the cancellation of the election. How is Hong Kong's situation seen in Southeast Asia, and is there a fear that this is a first step to perhaps a wider push on the part of Beijing to control not only the neighborhood but what's happening politically in neighboring countries? Oh,
absolutely. I mean, basically what you said, I think the writing is on the wall, and this is the implementation really. The one party, two systems has gone out of the window. And there is some hope that pragmatism, I mean, China has assured everybody that, business as usual will continue, so long as you don't indulge in political sort of dissent. But it's hard to separate the two. I mean, the country is Hong Kong is very divided. And this tension is going to prevail for a very long time. And it's hard to see China doing anything but clamping down harsh to suppress this kind of dissent, because it has to make an example of it. Otherwise, it's going to have problems elsewhere as well. So I think it's the Hong Kong situation is seen with also trepidation and concern and some pessimism, frankly. A little bit of hope again, because China has said again, it should be business as usual, financial flows will remain and so on and so forth. But the city has lost its sort of mojo, if you will, I mean, with this, and they're not going to get it any better.
Philip, let's shift gears, so to say, and talk about Turkey for a minute. In quietly, and in ways not so quietly, Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean and Libya is becoming a much more important and decisive player. And a number of European countries are trying to figure out, how do we deal with a Turkey that is more assertive, and trying to ask the question, how do we deal with an ally that is actually acting in ways that is not quite like allies do? How is Turkey being seen in Europe, and are there ideas about what to do about it?
Well, again, another of these strong men, as it were, Erdogan, is pushing out. And I think, what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean now, there are two stories here. One, there is a long-running conflict with Greece about maritime borders around the Eastern Mediterranean and Cyprus and the Greek islands. And this is important because there are lots and lots of gas reserves there. And Greece and Cyprus, Egypt and Israel have been getting together, talking about exploiting this gas and actually piping it to Israel. Turkey has now responded by starting to drill for gas itself off the coast of Turkish-occupied Cyprus, and sending warships. This has rolled into the conflict in Libya. Libya has become a sort of cockpit for regional rivalry with, on one side you've got Russia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia supporting the rebel claimants on government, and Turkey is actually supporting the UN recognized government of national accord in Tripoli. But Turkey again has now signed a maritime demarcation agreement with Libya, which is all about gas. So that's the sort of specific story about gas and about power in Libya. The more general story, I think, is the story again of American retreat. What's happened is that since the US has pulled out first of Iraq and Syria, it's left the playing field to the regional players, and Turkey, Iran, the UAE, Egypt, and others are basically are trying to, if you like, establish themselves as regional players. And the big players at the moment are Russia, Turkey, and Iran. And pushing back against them are Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, and of course, Assad in Syria. So you have these strange, really strange things now, like the UAE supporting the Assad government in Syria, these sort of alliances of convenience. My enemy's enemy is my friend. But it's essentially, here is a region in which from which American power has been withdrawn, and the big players in that region are fighting it out among themselves, and Turkey perhaps more aggressively than any of the others.
Karen, when you talk to your contacts in the State Department or in the White House, do they see it in the same way as Philip says? This is, and you know, this is a region where, frankly, the players in the region need to figure it out. We don't really have as large an interest in this. The Europeans, if they are upset about it, ought to do something about it. In some ways, the kind of argument you heard in parts of the Obama administration, is that the kind of view they're seeing, or is saying, no, we're there, we're doing lots of things? How do they look at this part of the world?
Well, I think the president certainly feels that the regional players should fight it out. You know, what are we doing there? Why do we need to be involved even in Iraq? You know, we've defeated the caliphate. I think that he's been very critical of the Obama administration's intervention in Libya, and everything that flowed from that, which you could say the current situation is kind of did flow from that. But I think that there's real ambivalence about Turkey. You know, Turkey's a NATO ally, as is Greece, obviously. Turkey is, according to some in the administration, holding the line against Iran and against Russia and against Assad in Syria. Turkey is keeping Syrian refugees from pouring again into Europe and potentially into this country. On the other hand, Turkey is buying Russian weapons. Turkey is causing problems in Libya. And I think they sort of don't know what to do about Turkey. Again, there's a lot of controversy and many different views about it. In Libya, I think that the administration has tried very hard not to be involved. You know, they showed up at the Berlin conference, I guess it was last year, but they really don't have a dog in the fight. And the argument is whether they should have or not. Every once in a while, the Secretary of State will stand up and say, you know, we need to all have talks about Libya. Or he'll say, you know, we did speak to UAE, or we spoke to the Egyptians, and we don't like the Russians sending their proxy forces in there. And why can't we all get along in Libya? But it doesn't seem like they're really prepared to do anything about it, to get involved in what's happening in Libya, certainly.
Nirmal,
Europe, just to add to your point, Europe likewise, basically it's effectively being blackmailed by Erdogan, who's saying, you know, you push me too hard, I'm going to do what I did in 2015 and open the borders and I've got another 2,000 Syrian refugees sitting in camps, in Turkey or on the Syrian border, and I'm going to say, wave them all goodbye to Europe. And so, it's horrible to say, but Europe is effectively paralyzed by this threat.
I think it's 2 million. I think you said 2,000.
2 million, yeah.
Mm.
That Turkey has been taken care of, and the EU has been paying, but they are in Turkey, and Turkey has had to deal with this issue. Nirmal, this has all the markings of a international system gone awry, with no one willing to check or anyone else, and everyone just going out for themselves. Is this kind of the fear that Southeast Asia has that will happen in in sort of a post-American world? Is this the beginning of a post-American world that we're seeing in Europe that has an impact as well on what's happening in views in Southeast Asia?
Yes, to some extent, yes, absolutely. Yeah, it is. A lot depends on. I have to say, a lot depends on what happens on November 3rd in the U.S. election. Like, if President Donald Trump in this dispensation gets reelected, then we will see a consolidation of the sort of doctrine, if you like, the America First unilateralism, disengagement from multilateral agreements, arrangements, and agencies and whatnot. And the countries in Asia would certainly like to see the U.S. to re-engage in multilateral agencies. I mean, the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, WHO, and so forth was seen, and JCPOA. However, you could construct rationales for all these, perfectly good rationales for all these, but it was still seen as alarm because it disturbed the status quo. It was disruptive. So another Trump administration will be more of the same, and it depends on then whether you see the glass as half empty or half full. Half full, you could say, it's America's takes a more mercantilist but robust attitude towards competition, say, from China, or half empty. There's erratic. There's not much diplomacy. There's sort of uncertainty and erratic sort of short-term tactical approach, mercantile approach again. So yeah, I mean. You're right. It is seen as a potential post-American era, but it is also an exaggeration to say that sort of China's day has arrived. For example, in the South China Sea, you have other claimants also with substantial military assets in the region. It's not as if China has got everything to itself. You still have the US there with its phone ops and so forth. You have India beefing up tremendously to counter. The part of the problem is that India has been trying to catch up with its border infrastructure, and that was seen by China as provocative. So they kind of moved against it. But you have all these countries, and Vietnam has been taking a strong stance against China as well. So you do see it is not, China has not won the day, and as I think it was Philip who said about, or was it Karen? I forget. Sorry, about Mike Pompeo's speech about this whole Western democracy alignment and so forth. I think the jury is still out, and I think the situation as far as Asia is concerned will become clearer after 4 months or so. If Joe Biden wins and a Democratic Party administration comes in, there will be a restoration of some of the sort of diplomatic ties. There will be a re-engagement in multilateral institutions, and that will be generally welcomed. But it will remain. It still remains to be seen whether the engagement in Asia specifically will be more holistic and robust.
Karen, switching back to the Mediterranean and now the very Eastern Mediterranean, Israel, and talking about time may be running out for the Israeli government, both with regard to the Prime Minister Netanyahu, but also with regard to the elections and the in the U.S. and the ability to move on questions like the West Bank. A lot of turmoil in Israel these days that we hadn't expected after the new government was overwhelmingly put together, with an overwhelming majority was put together, and yet it seems to be things are not moving in the way that Bibi Netanyahu thought they were going to move?
Well, I think if you go back several months in the sort of pre-virus world, if we can do that, you saw the release of the Trump administration's plan for Israel and the Palestinians, which called for turning over as much as a third of the West Bank to Israel, and Netanyahu jumping right in and saying, "Yep, that's what I've always said. We're going to annex those areas." And everybody said, July 1st, that's the deadline. That's when it's going to happen. But what's happened since then in Israel is kind of similar to what's happened in this country. You saw with the virus, you saw initial kind of spikes, went down, things got better. Netanyahu said, great, open the schools, open the restaurants, open everything. Let's get our economy going again. And then things went south again very quickly, where you have rising cases, you have a lot of concern. And July 1st kind of came and went with no announcement about annexation. In the meantime, you have the Arab states, particularly in the Persian Gulf, that the administration was counting on to be supportive of Israel in terms of the agreement and to kind of take care of the Palestinians who have refused to negotiate at all over it. They're coming up now. The UAE again this week said, look, don't expect any normalization with it if you actually do this. Politically, in domestic terms, they just can't do it. The UAE, the Saudis cannot do that publicly. You've had, because of the virus and because of the economy, what's happened with the economy, same as here, you've seen Netanyahu, who 6 months ago was quite popular. Really, his numbers have taken a total dive. There are big demonstrations outside his residence. There have been riots there. There have been fights. So I are not going the way anyone intended. In the meantime, the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority has again found, at least on this issue, common. They've gone around to Europe drumming up support. And you have Joe Biden coming in and saying, well, here's my Israel policy. Trump has to kind of paint Biden as anti-Israel, and one of his talking points is that you elect Joe Biden and support for Israel. Biden has said, look, the Obama administration gave you the Iron Dome, anti-missile protection. They increased security assistance to Israel. He has said, I'm against these boycott movements of Israel. I'm still for a two-state solution. Let's go back to when things were actually moving in a positive direction. So that's kind of where things stand right now. Puts it past Netanyahu to announce tomorrow that annexation is going into effect. I mean, he can, as with Trump, I mean, he does sort of shock and awe, things like that. But the plan has definitely suffered some real damage.
Nirmal, Philip, a minute or so left. So Nirmal, a comment on what does annexation mean? At the same time, in Southeast Asia, you're trying to prevent the annexation of rocks, reefs, islands by China. Is there a natural way to reject this, or how is that seen?
Oh, well, I think now that the US has come out with a stronger position, and the Philippines, of course, won that landmark judgment, and Vietnam and other countries, Indonesia, have started taking more diplomatic initiatives. So to sort of ring fence China with diplomacy and try and sort of shore up the moral case, really, if you will, right, by going to international courts and making diplomatic moves and so forth, is seen as one way to keep this issue high on the agenda and send up symbolic warning flags for China that, you know, this is only as this is as far as you should go. And then, of course, we have the code of conduct, which has been moving at a glacial speed. But eventually something will come out of it. Even China is saying that, yes, we should have this code of conduct and so forth. We have to watch that. That is one opportunity for a meaningful code of conduct. So if that, again, that's been going on for so long, so we don't know if something actually comes out of it and reasonably soon, then that could provide some sort of blueprint or roadmap going forward, which could alleviate tension. But nobody is sort of holding their breath for the code of conduct still.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you all, Nirmal, Philip, Karen. Wonderful to have the conversation with the three of you. We'll do it again next week. And in the meantime, I wish you all a terrific weekend. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Great conversation.
Best.
Thank you.